That's one example about how your problem solving could save the deal. But the sellers aren't thinking rational. They're not coming up with solutions. But who do you think has to be rational and come up with these solutions in order to just go ahead and close on the house and put this as bridge, put this under the rug, right? Bridge underwater, yeah, that isn't even water under the bridge. I don't know these old fogey sayings, but somebody does. Now we have a problem. How do you fix it? Right? So this is a little bit of a conundrum because you're like, well, the buyers want to buy the home, but unfortunately this house isn't actually as big as you said it was because the heated square feet wasn't actually the full amount. So now we've got no, it's financing. So now we actually have to take away 630 square feet from the price per square foot. So now we have to reduce the price of the value of the home by $69,000. Now the deal is going to fall apart unless the buyer gets what they're paying for. Of course, what does the buyer want? They want to reduce their price to the actual heated square footage of the home. The seller, on the other hand, says, wait, we wanted this price and everything that we're doing is based on this amount. We can't reduce our price by $69,000. What do we do? So in situations like this, it could go south. The whole deal can go south. So we have a couple of options. Either A, the seller can hire an AC company to provide additional ductwork that leads to the interior of the Florida room. So now it's being cooled and the buyers are satisfied. Now, what would it cost the seller to actually go ahead and go through the trouble of just adding additional ductwork that led to the Florida room? A lot less than $69,000, right? There you go. It'd be $1,300 to $1,500 to do something like that. I'll go back to the fishing analogies. All right?
There you go. Thank you.
So what happens is you're kind of like, oh, I'm about to lose a deal. We spent a lot of time. We spent a lot of money. We're up to this point, and the deal's going to fall apart. Solutions, solutions, solutions. So then the buyer says, hey, if they reduce the property by $10,000, oh, I'll take it. I don't care. Whatever. Right? That's also another solution. Because in this situation, would we want to tell somebody like, oh no, this is such a big problem, $69,000, value, so on and so forth. You have to determine what does the buyer feel about this and what is the value based, what is this implication or the value based around. So then if the buyer's like, hey, listen, if they gave me $15,000, I'm happy, I'll take it. Say, okay, hey sellers, would you pay $15,000 or take $15,000 off the price? My buyer will take it, everyone's happy. Now remember, this is the buyer making the decision. So you got to make sure the buyer is satisfied with what you're asking for. But do you as the agent want to go back to the buyer and say, oh, you know what buyer, this is a mess. I mean, we're talking about $69,000 difference, so on and so forth. Who determines the value of the home? It's between the buyer and the appraisal when it all comes down to it, right? So we have to determine, a lot of times I would just say, buyer, what would you like to do in this situation? How would you like to handle it? Because they might give an answer that sounds really good and is an easy solution. You're like, wow, that was simpler than I thought it was going to be. Why don't I just ask for that? Right? Other than you kind of making a big, heavy-handed situation out of it. Right? Now, a seller that's selling a home and they have a situation where they need to stay in that property or they don't want to close within a certain time frame because they're not ready, their other house they need to buy isn't ready, whatever the case is, and now you're in a weird situation. Because you told the sellers, you said that you would close by this date. You told the buyers that you would close by this date, and now you're trying to get more time, or you're trying to stay in the house after the closing. Be like, that's a little dangerous. But how do you convince the seller otherwise or not to kill the whole deal because of this particular situation? What are your solutions? Does anybody have any practical solution on allowing the seller to have more time, even though they already agreed to close at the end of the month with this buyer who's counting on moving in?
Consider leasing it back from the new owner.
Okay, so one option could be a post-occupancy by the seller. So it's like, seller, if the buyer's okay with this, and if the buyer's not in a hurry, and if the buyer's not looking forward to moving into the property directly after closing, maybe we might be able to ask them to consider allowing you to stay in the property after the closing, and you just pay them a per day rate. Provide them a security deposit in case you damage the home on the way out. But maybe we can have them allow you to stay in the property for, that 15 or 30 days after closing. That's an option. Now, what is another option for the seller? If that post-occupancy is out of the question for that buyer. The buyer said, nope, they said they closed at the end of the month, we're closing at the end of the month. Well, you have to make it sound as simple and as easy for the seller as possible. So you come up with a solution. Hey guys, no problem. Something we could do is we can go ahead and have a portable on-delivery service, like pods, where they'll just pull up and drop off a storage container. You put all your belongings in there, they'll come and pick it up, and you guys could stay in a short-term rental for 2 weeks or 1 week or whatever it is you need until you purchase your next home. And when you purchase your next home, they drop off those portable storage units on your front doorstep of your new home, and you move all the contents within, right? Half the sellers don't even think or consider this. They're just like, oh, yeah, I mean, that doesn't sound bad. And say, seller, you know what else too? I think it's going to be better to do a short-term rental for a week or so, because we're in Orlando, Florida. We have so many resorts in the area. It's like, why don't you just take a vacation for 2 weeks, right? Stay in this place, short-term rental, a week at a time, 3 days at a time, whatever. And literally it's like, okay, just pack a suitcase and you're straight. And then what happens is that's actually going to be cheaper than trying to arrange a post-occupancy with the new owner of the home and provide a security deposit and sign a lease agreement. The whole thing, it's a mess. Why don't you guys just stay at this resort? Have you heard of that resort over by SeaWorld, right across from Shingle Creek and Universal Boulevard? Was it Vista K? I feel like you can literally stay there in one of those townhomes for a week and still be in a better position than digging your heels in the ground, saying you're not going to move, or trying to negotiate a post-occupancy to the new purchaser.
Can you, from the beginning, set up like a longer close date? Like if you know this is already could possibly be an issue, like can you just set up from the beginning?
You could. So what happens if the buyer submits an offer and say, we want to close in 30 days, the seller can say, we want to close in 60 days. And what they could do is they could say, well, let's meet in the middle because we need more time and the buyer wants to close sooner. So let's see if we could come to an agreement because we know we need 60 days. Okay, so that's one option. Number two, I've seen agents do this before where they put on the closing date, they'll put on or before 5/31/2019. And the other agent the other day said, hey, is anyone really obligated to close sooner than that closing date? And technically what that means, it says buyer and seller agree to close on the date listed below. And if you put on or before this date, then technically the seller can decide to close a week earlier because the buyer already agreed to it in the contract. So as long as that buyer has secured their financing, or they've gotten that financing contingency or that financing commitment from the lender and said, hey sellers, we have the financing commitment, we're good to go. Seller could say, all right, let's close tomorrow, right? But if the buyer's like, well, we actually want to close in like 2 weeks, technically that buyer already agreed to close before the actual closing date. What's preventing them from closing? Because they already said we'd close on or before this date.
You can take on 2 mortgages? Like for instance, if they didn't already have another home?
No, not necessarily, because what happens is when the buyer's agreeing to purchase that seller's home, they said, I'll buy your home, just give me 30 days to get financing. And what happens is after the 30 days, they get the financing and they get that commitment letter from the bank and they say, seller, just to let you know, we have this. And technically, we're still 2 or 3 weeks away from the actual closing date. Seller can just say, all right, cool, let's close Friday. And the buyer might say, well, we have 3 weeks. Be like, we already agreed to close on or before this date. You didn't have any exception to the rule. So that's why if your buyer or seller need a specific day to close, just be very specific with the date on the contract. So then the buyer's going to say, well, we said we'd close on the 31st. That's when we're going to close, right? Now, if they want to do on or before, make sure that the buyer and seller are aware that that's what it means, right? What happens during the financing contingency period? This is another thing that we want to talk about. So, what do you say to a buyer or a seller in a situation where we are the buyer, we said we needed 30 days to close, and now the lender is coming around saying, hey, we hit a snag, doesn't look like we'll be able to get approval for you, and technically we're 3 days away from the end of our financing contingency period. So the buyer had 30 days, and on day 27, lender says, we have some issues with underwriting, they need more time, you know, I did everything I was supposed to do, but they're kind of dragging their feet, they're really backed up, we need more time.
You either request extension from the listing agent, or if they're not willing to extend, then you request a denial letter from the lender to protect your buyer.
Correct. And so what happens is we, as the buyer's agent, have to first and foremost, before ever even considering saving the deal, we have to protect that buyer's escrow deposit. That's our number one priority. Protect the buyer's escrow deposit. Now there are some fail-safes in the contract that will prevent them from losing their escrow deposit. And one of those fail-safes is your contingency for financing. So what happens to a lot of agents are they'll call the listing agent and say, hey, listing agent, I'm so sorry to tell you this, but I just heard from the lender and they said that they're not going to actually have the financing ready. And the underwriter said that they need another week. Now, in most cases, the listing agent is going to say, okay, fine, you need another week, I'll talk to the seller, see if we can give you an extension. And what happens is the buyer and the seller sign an extension for 1 week, except for there's one problem. Well, besides that. The problem is they need an extension for closing date and an extension for financing contingency period. I always see agents get burned on this one. And I'm like, they call me a week later and they say, hey, the lender doesn't have the money. We got an extension for 1 week. Now the lender's saying they can't get them the money. What do we do to save their escrow deposit? I'm like, send them a release and cancellation and the denial letter. And then all of a sudden they call me back and they say, the listing agent says this isn't gonna work. I'm like, why not? They're like, I only extended the closing date, not the financing contingency period. So the financing contingency period ran out in 30 days. What they should have done is got a 7-day extension for the financing contingency period and an extension for closing if needed. Does everybody understand that?
Correct.
Okay. So you never want to be in a predicament where you got more time to close, but you didn't get more time to protect their escrow deposit. Okay. How do we fix a situation like this? Right? So sometimes when you could buy your customer more time, is there going to be a couple options. Either A, they've lost faith in this lender and the lender wasn't able to do it for whatever reason. So in some cases, the sellers might give an extension, but they're not going to hand it out willingly. So sometimes either A, you can talk to your buyers and say, buyers, you've given a $3,000 escrow deposit. I've asked for an extension. They flat out said no. We've come too far. We've spent money on inspections, appraisals, we've spent time, and we're this close, and the seller said no. How do we get that extra time? Well, one method is to say, buyer, would you be willing to release $1,000 of your escrow deposit to the sellers in order to get that 1 or 2 week extension? Now, sometimes if the buyer says, well, what options do I have? I'm like, well, you don't have any. Because what happens right now is, you're at the end of your financing contingency period and you're supposed to close in 4 days from now. And technically they're not giving us more time and your 30 days is up. So as far as I'm concerned, if you don't show up to closing, you've already lost your escrow deposit.